Here is Mike Lee explaining, this is Senator Mike Lee from Utah. He is explaining what the problem is in this country, why we are in the shape that we're in at this moment.
And let me guess, Sam, you think you're so much more certain of it than he is. Sam Seder being super arrogant. Well, that's not a surprise.
And of course, it's because too much reliance on government.
Well, in this case, it's not even really a matter of relying on government. It's the government butting in whether it's relied upon or not. There's a good chance that if it wasn't for government forcing these lockdowns on everybody, enough people would have caught the virus that we've already would have built up an immunity to it by now.
It still is something that we should worry about from a liberty standpoint when they exercise these sweeping powers.
Well, this is simply verified by looking at history. Look at some of the worst atrocities that happened throughout history. Were they committed by the private sector being unregulated, or by some authoritarian tyrant under the pretense of the greater good of society or whatever?
When they say, I hereby declare that you can't go to work.
Which is extremely easy for politicians to declare since they're more or less guaranteed an income. You know how fucking arrogant you have to be guaranteed an income, to have to be paid by force because no one would voluntarily pay for your service, and have the audacity to think you should be able to decide which businesses are essential and which aren't?
Or that you've got to wear a mask, or a mask and a green hat and a face shield, or whatever it is that they want.
I've went over this in previous videos, but since you own your body, you have a right to decide what to wear on it. Private establishments may decide to restrict what you wear into their establishment as a condition of doing business, but there's no such thing as a sweeping power to just decide what everybody has to wear across the board.
To do. For the simple reason that, number one, you don't always know.
This guy's such a pig. It's unbelievable.
So notice how he's insulting him and trying to paint him in a negative light before he even introduces his criticisms. This is called poisoning the well. Basically, you're trying to taint your opposition in order to plant a bias against them in your audience. Basically, it's a way to try and make your argument seem more convincing when you have basically nothing of substance to say.
Green hat? Like the mask is just a sort of like, oh, everybody's going to wear underwear on their head today. That's how silly this is.
Well, if the government can force you to wear masks against your will, if they own your body essentially, which is what would have to be the case in order for these orders to be legitimate, there'd be nothing stopping them from forcing you to wear underwear on your head as well.
This is just like, there's just like a random exercise of power.
You know, I think David Pacman made the same lousy argument in one of his social contract videos. Why does something have to be random or spontaneous as a necessary condition of being unjust? If having a reason to do something is all that's required for it to be justified, then there's literally no atrocity in history that wouldn't have been justified.
Like, how effing irresponsible.
So the belief that the people in charge or who wield power should be held accountable is somehow irresponsible. Yeah, can you walk me through the logic there, buddy?
Is it for that a-hole?
That effing a-hole. Look, Sam, either you have the balls to swear or you don't. You sound like a 12-year-old trying to be edgy when you do that.
I mean, if you want to make the argument that having protections that inhibit the spread of a disease to other people is a infringement upon liberty.
Only when implemented coercively. There are plenty of ways to have protections against the spread of a disease that don't violate individual liberty. This is that typical leftist authoritarian mentality of either we do this my way or we don't do it at all. If you're against welfare, you must hate the poor. If you're against the Civil Rights Act, you must be racist. The problem with this strategy is that it ignores the actual argument, which is there are non-coercive and non-violent ways of dealing with these issues.
Like, I don't know why he hasn't been on and on about smoking, like, in this regard too, right?
Well, the mandatory mask orders and the ban on smoking in public places are both examples of the government using coercion to protect public health or whatever. There's a reason there tends to be typically more outrage toward the mask orders. First of all, the smoking orders are inherently less intrusive since it's a mandate not to do something rather than to do something. Second of all, these smoking orders affect less people. Only a portion of the population smokes, so there'd still be an overwhelming majority of people who usually don't smoke in public anyway and therefore aren't affected at all by the order. And third of all, unlike the mask orders, there aren't any medical conditions out there that could potentially inhibit one's ability to comply with these smoking orders. There aren't a whole lot of conditions in which one has to smoke, but there are some conditions that make it difficult or even impossible for people to wear masks, such as people with certain respiratory conditions.
I mean, smoking There's a reason why in public buildings you can't smoke.
So a lot of these people who argue in favor of these mask orders, they'll usually compare it to other forms of authoritarianism that are supposedly implemented for people's safety, such as seatbelts is another common example. I think Kyle Kulinski used that one. The argument basically goes like this. They point to some example of authoritarianism for safety we already have on the books and say, look, we already do this. Is it really that bad if we keep doing it? The problem is that it presupposes that these other forms of authoritarianism are fair or legitimate or should be implemented. Simply pointing to examples of things that have been done to justify continuing doing them is what's known as the appeal to tradition fallacy. All forms of authoritarianism need some sort of independent justification, be it mask orders, seatbelt laws, smoking laws, whatever.
Because it inhibits other people's health.
Well, that assumes that there's no possible way to accommodate smoking in public buildings that doesn't interfere with other people's health. Now, I wholeheartedly sympathize with the sentiment against smoking in public buildings, and I can totally see why a ban on it would be appealing. But is a ban really the best way of dealing with this? Because I remember back when smoking in restaurants used to be legal, and shit, I was like 7, so I'm going pretty far back here. But I remember you'd walk into a restaurant, they'd ask you smoking or non-smoking, and they'd have a smoking section and a non-smoking section. The problem is that there would be no physical barrier between the smoking and non-smoking sections. So even though all the smokers were only sitting in one part of the restaurant because there was no way to contain the smoke, and that smoke would just go all throughout the restaurant, and before you know it, the whole restaurant would just smell like smoke. And what I learned was that America is pretty much the only country in the world that does this, that had no physical separation between the smoking and non-smoking section. In Japan, a lot of public buildings do allow smoking. However, there's another room, it's a separated room that's contained, so the smoke doesn't go throughout the restaurant, and it's ventilated, so there's fans that remove the smoke to keep the smoke from building up inside that room. And this strikes me as a much more reasonable and innovative way to deal with smoking in public places rather than just outright banning it.
I mean, even his libertarian ideology where, your right to push your fist ends at my nose. Well, your right to aerosolize the virus during a pandemic ends when it starts to kill other people. How's that?
So this is a common argument you'll hear, especially from the mandatory vaccinations crowd. By not going along with our public health measure, whether it be mandatory masks, mandatory vaccinations, whatever, you're endangering innocent people and therefore violating the non-aggression principle. So libertarians should actually be on board with whatever mandatory public health measure they want to implement. So they're correct that it does violate the non-aggression principle to knowingly and willfully either infect someone with a disease or put them at risk of being infected by a disease. So if someone is sick and they know that they're sick, you may have a non-aggression principle argument to make that they should be obligated to wear a mask in public or take some sort of public safety measures. And if these mask orders are more targeted, more directed towards those individuals who had it and knew they had it, you'd probably have much more of a stronger justification to invoke the non-aggression principle here. The problem is that this is just a blanket mandate to force everybody to wear masks. There's no obligation that they actually prove that you're a danger to public health. You may possibly spread the virus, so we're going to force you to take these safety measures. Well, why stop at the virus then? If the standard by which we impose the non-aggression principle is potential harm rather than actual harm, then why stop at the virus? You see, people with arms could potentially punch somebody, so let's order that people wear handcuffs everywhere. Sure, they may not actually punch anybody, but why take the risk? Better safe than sorry, am I right?
But the idea that he would refer to as like face masks and shields and a green hat, as if it's just like some type of, these guys are just trying to see what they can make you wear to make you look silly.
Well, how do you know that's not the case, Sam? How do you know that state governors aren't forcing people to wear masks just so that they can see what they can get away with forcing people to wear? What's stopping them from saying that the little green hats will keep you safe from the virus and mandating them on those grounds? And most importantly, if it does end up being the case that the government is forcing people to wear masks just to make you look silly and not actually protect you from the virus, well, what recourse do you have? By accepting the authority that government has to force you to wear something against your will, you've basically set the precedent that they own your body. So even if they flat out said, yeah, we're going to force you to wear little green hats because we want you to look silly, it doesn't actually benefit you in any way, you would not be free to disobey. I mean, that would probably be too ridiculous even for the most stick-in-the-ass cop to enforce, but in principle at least, you would still be obliged to wear the hat on those grounds.
What a effing a-hole.
You remember?
So according to Sam here, this guy apparently deserves scorn for the horrible, heinous act of simply criticizing the government's grab of authority here. Like, he's not even necessarily saying that it's a bad thing for government to do this. He's just saying people should be critical of it. And just for this, Sam wants to label him a fucking asshole. Yeah, government isn't a religion, my ass.
Remember when we covered the libertarian debate and people said we were unfair because those were just the kooks? It's like, no,
Right.
this is what this is.
This is all they have. This is all they have. Why do people watch this show? I mean, even David Pacman and Kyle Kulinski at least put in some effort to make actual arguments. See, if you put actual effort into making your arguments, I'll respect you. Even if I don't agree with your opinion, I'll still respect that you're putting in time, effort, and actually trying to make a good argument. But just listening to you insult people without any substance, honestly, it's actually pretty boring. Like, I legit get bored of watching the Majority Report, as they spend a whole lot of time on insults, bashing people, trying to demean people, but very little time on actual arguments.
Senator from Utah. There's only 100 of these people, and here's one of them.
And unfortunately, it seems like he's the only one. Well, I think New Mexico had a libertarian senator as well.
In the country. Continue.
Or whatever it is that they want to do. For the simple reason that, number one, you don't always know what state statutory or state constitutional authority pursuant to which they might be acting. In fact, they often don't know. If you dig into these things, very often they're just airballing this stuff. Not all the time, but sometimes they are. It's important to ask those questions.
Putting aside the morality of it, from a purely legal standpoint, the authority under which these orders are being implemented does seem rather dubious. Especially when you actually look into it, look at the state constitutions, look at the Emergency Powers Clause, you'll see that the scope of the powers that can be invoked during an emergency are actually very limited. If you look carefully at these state constitutions, they never mention the power to force businesses to close, or to force people to stay home or not work or whatever. And this is an aspect of the conversation I feel isn't getting nearly enough attention as it should, because it really does seem like the state governors are pulling this authority out of their ass. There's no statutory law or constitutional law that's really giving them the authority to do this.
It's also important to ask, to the extent you're intruding on my liberty, even if it's not something that is constitutionally prohibited, and even if you do have statutory and or state constitutional authority to do what you're saying, is this intrusion into the liberty of the citizenry worth it?
So keep in mind what this guy is saying. He's not saying that any and all government exercise of authority is bad. He's just saying, is it worth it? We should criticize and evaluate it, see if the costs are worth the benefits. This is important because Sam tries to misinterpret what he says later.
I think we've lost, as a society, the tendency to engage in this kind of critical thinking with regard to our government. We have societally been conditioned to accept the idea that government knows best. And I think it's important for us to push back on that.
He's correct that people are often conditioned into the mentality of dependence on government. After all, people spend a good dozen years of their life in an education system controlled by and funded by government. So, what are the odds that people are going to develop the critical thinking skills needed to criticize government fairly? But I've noticed a rather pleasant trend, actually. It seems like as of recently, libertarianism is on the rise. It seems like new libertarian YouTube channels are popping up all the time. And after the 2016 election, it seems like faith in the federal government is at an all-time low. So while we as a society have largely been conditioned to accept big government and see it as the solution to all our problems, I take comfort in the fact that the trend seems to be reversing.
You dumbass. Why
Oh, I guess Sam doesn't have qualms with actually swearing anymore.
don't you go make out with Louis Gohmert?
Yeah.
A little pushback.
Well, you're just just because the government tells you that it's you could get coronavirus?
Just because the government says something doesn't automatically make it true. If a person is making a claim, that claim needs to be independently verified, regardless of the organization that person's affiliated with. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, an idea being from the government is more reason to scrutinize it, not less.
Why don't you go hang out in a sauna with Louis Gohmert?
So if this guy doesn't think that coronavirus is a legitimate excuse for the government to violate our rights, it must mean that he wants to catch coronavirus, or thinks that people should catch coronavirus, apparently.
Idiot. What an idiot. What an idiot.
I could give fair consideration to the arguments being made and try to formulate an actual counter-argument, but that would take actual effort and intellectual honesty. It would be much easier just to insult him and misrepresent his position. For fuck's sake, how did this guy get a high school diploma, let alone a college degree?
That type of he should be. Someone should sue that guy.
Well, you see, Your Honor, the defendant was supporting my freedom and challenging me to think critically, and this really hurt my feelings. So I demand pain and suffering and compensatory damages.
For going out there and saying this kind of stuff.
Sam, quite frankly, I'd love to sue you for all the bullshit you spew out of your mouth, but unfortunately, I do believe in free speech and, consistency and all that.
It is insanity. It is absolutely insanity. The whole concept of you wearing a mask is an infringement upon your liberty is absurd.
Well, it's not the masks themselves that's infringement on liberty. Of course, plenty of people feel that the masks keep them safer, those around them safer, and they're more than free to wear one. When people are forced to wear one against their will, that's where the problem is.
It is totally absurd.
They never remember about the NAP.
The what?
The non-aggression principle.
Oh, right.
All right, again, if somebody is going around and purposefully and willingly spreading around this virus with the intention of getting people sick, then that violates the non-aggression principle, and you can use force to protect yourself from them. When you're blanket forcing everybody to wear masks on a hunch that they may potentially be spreading the virus, then that's a different story.
Right.
Oh.
And here's why right-wing libertarians and anarchist types can't ever get along and shouldn't.
Well, I don't see why not. Under the ideals of libertarianism and anarchism or whatever, you would be free to associate on whatever basis you see fit. So the people who want to associate on a market basis can go do that, and the people who want to associate on a collectivized basis can go do that.
Anarchists respect experts, and they respect science on a level that these people don't.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
Wow, so much inaccuracy in one sentence that almost blew my mind. Anarchism is rejection of the state. In other words, extreme criticism and skepticism of experts. Also, since anarchism is a political ideology, it has nothing to do with scientific principles, so I'm not sure exactly why you're trying to draw the connection between the two here. Anarchism rejects the state, not science. Yet again, this is probably what one should expect from someone who claims to be an anarchist, but at the same time supports welfareism.
This whole concept of that personal liberty is being infringed when someone says during a pandemic.
So what, basic rights and principles of fairness go out the window just because a situation is labeled a pandemic? And who is it that gets to decide when a situation becomes a pandemic? Would it be the government? The government gets to decide when a situation warrants expanding its own power. Gee, that's not putting the fox in charge of the hen house at all.
You need to wear a mask.
They're not just saying you gotta wear a mask. They're not politely asking or suggesting. It's a law. There's a gun. If you don't put the mask on, they will escalate and you'll get hurt. As part of the irony of creating laws to protect people for their own good, you're trying to get people out of harm's way by essentially putting them in harm's way.
It's just sheer insanity. It's sheer insanity.
I like how being concerned about basic civil liberties comes across to Sam as sheer insanity, but the fact that the government ballooned immensely and took greater control over our lives like that over something less likely to kill you than the flu doesn't.
Where's the whole thing where the Constitution is not a suicide pact?
Where on the Constitution does it say all of this is contingent upon health? I think Ron Paul said it best. There's no 11th Amendment to the Bill of Rights that says none of this applies if we get sick.
How come we only hear those guys when it comes to protecting the civil liberties of people who are not white?
Well, where did that come from? We're concerned about the fundamental freedoms of everybody. Why does the left always like to bring race into things when it's not relevant? Oh, because they can't form a counter-argument that stands on its own weight. That's right.
Yeah. I like the pivot that he does where he says, even if it is constitutionally, allowed, and does have legal precedent.
What legal precedent? Where? Give me either a constitutional clause, a statute, or a reference to a court case that says the government can force you to wear masks against your will. Just one.
We got to consider what Liberty might think about this, of getting people infected.
Or, what if, and I know this will sound crazy, but just hear me out on it. What if I told you that those two things aren't mutually exclusive? What if you can have liberty and take precautions to prevent the spread of the disease. What if, for example, instead of forcing people to do shit, we spread the word to get them to voluntarily do it? Yeah, solving problems without violence. I know, it's a crazy, weird concept, but just bear with me on this, okay?
Well, actually, true liberty is being able to use eviction courts to throw out a tenant during a pandemic depression.
This seems to be a typical left-wing way to end videos. Just briefly mention some completely unrelated topic. But anyways, apparently I should be entitled to use other people's property without payment, just because there's a disease going around less likely to kill you than the flu. Oh, there's a mass eviction crisis going on. Oh gee, I think that might have something to do with the government telling people they can't work. So yeah, this was your typical Majority Report video. I've heard absolutely no convincing rebuttals from Sam. If they're not insulting him or trying to attack him personally, they're discussing completely unrelated stuff like evictions and smoking laws. How the fuck does this channel have almost 1 million subs? This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.